It's an incredible story that you could never write. You would never write it this way. You know what I mean? Like if you had to sit down and think about a world story, you would never think about a sacrificing Messiah, any of these kinds of things where God would enter his own creation as a man and do these things. And here's what I would say.
Well, man, back at it in 2025, just finished the first podcast this year. It's been a minute since the last one. And I regret that this one wasn't a 3-hour Joe Rogan style podcast. There was so much left to be said. I had the chance to talk to a good friend of mine, Greg Koukl, who is a pastor, a videographer, and a rancher of all things. Greg does a lot of work with Stand to Reason, the ministry started by Greg Koukl, who wrote the incredible book Tactics that has influenced me a ton. So Greg is in the apologetic space, and a pretty unique combination, right? Pastor, apologist, videographer, rancher. So we talk a little bit about how did the Lord weave all of these things together in your story. And we talked about, man, what did we talk about? Just how human beings are made to be creative and storytellers, and talked about things like, what is the story God's telling? Do we understand it? How do we see ourselves in light of that story? And even more, are we listening to a different story that somebody else is telling? And how does this affect our sense of ourselves and identity and our place and our purpose in this world? Interesting enough, there's a ton of apologetic implication and value when it comes to storytelling. And so we dive into that. But Greg himself is a great storyteller, and he, in a beautiful fashion, in a portion of our talk, tells the story God is telling, and you have got to hear it. So, if you're into apologetics and storytelling and how we as Christians need to be good storytellers and how we need to protect our children and those that we love from buying into these false narratives, this podcast's for you. All right, Greg. So you are in an interesting line of work. Pastor, videographer. A lot of your film work is in the apologetic space.
Right.
And you're now a rancher.
That's right.
What's the common thread here, man?
It's funny. It's a great question because I've been asking that single question myself. What is the thread here? It's a good thing I believe in sovereignty, because nobody writes a story like this on purpose. It has to be, it has to be transcendent from your life, because you would never put this on paper. Right. And so, boy, the lives that God has let me lead in different, in different spheres has been fascinating. If it's true, right. My world is story, largely. Only God writes stories like that, because it's crazy. I could bore you with a ton of details about how it happened and whatever, but it's a wild ride, man. It's been a wild ride. I feel bad for my wife always. I'm like, hey, so here's a new chapter.
Don't we all always feel bad for our wives?
It's true.
This is one of God's great gifts. He allows us to marry out of our league. Well, I do want to hear these details. Now, I don't want you to bore me with them or anybody else, but I am curious how you got into all this and a little bit of your journey here, because it's kind of like, pastor, videographer with, not everything you do is in the apologetic space, but a lot of it is.
Right.
And rancher. It's like, are you the only person in the planet that checks all those boxes?
I hope so. I want to find my niche. I'm trying to find that. I
get really. I'm so weird. I get excited about things like that. Like I'll be driving in the car and I'll be listening to Outkast on the way to a speaking engagement while I'm processing like something out of 2 Timothy chapter 2, the end of that chapter, if you know what that's about, while I'm thinking of apologetic implications. And I'm like, how many people are experiencing anything? I'm probably the only person on the planet right now with these combination of things happening at the same time. Or if there's another person that's doing the same thing, I really want to meet that person. So I get so I enjoy these things, and there's just such a uniqueness about, where the Lord has led you, and without boring us, curious, man, how this came together, the pastor, video work, apologetics. Just give us a bit how you got there.
Okay, so it's actually a deeper story than that, and you're right that we got to find each other, right? Guys like us, because there's so few of us, so we got to like latch on to each other, right? But so actually, my story started. I mean, I grew up in the church my whole life, right? So I always, the church that I grew up in Southern California, which is where I was raised, I was actually at this one church. The pastor that was there was at my birth, and then I grew up in that whole church until I was 21. But at 21, I moved to Arizona and became a police officer. And so that's where it actually started. My thought initially was God's made me to be a cop, and that's what I'm going to do. And, that's why I'm on the earth. And
so you and J. Warner Wallace.
Yeah, right. I did that for a while and I ended up, ironically, not liking it. I wanted to be it since I was a little kid, about 6 years old. And then I had, family members who were in it and didn't like it. And so it was like, wow, okay. So, inside of all of that, though, as I'm, in law enforcement working and working the streets, I was always in the church. I was always working with youth and doing all this kind of pastoral, but at the, just at the lay level, and just always had this drive to just, be in the church. And so after police work, it was like, I don't know who I am, but, it simultaneously as God was kind of transitioning out of that, he brings me into, I think pastoral work is where you're supposed to go. And so I was in Arizona at the time, and we went back to California, and I went to Bible college and then started my pastoral journey and started right away as a teaching pastor. Had a real drive and hunger to learn and to know.
And you hadn't been to seminary yet or anything, right?
No, I really cut my teeth in ministry at the Bible college level. Yeah. Which is interesting. In fact, it's not the norm, I don't think, for a lot of people. I was a little bit older. I wasn't, fresh out of high school or fresh out of whatever, but, and I'd already had some life experience. So I think that's kind of what maybe helped carry me a little bit in that world. And so I started that. After 4 years of that, then I kind of went to Louisville, Kentucky and went to seminary. And it was at seminary. Now,
and listen, you were married at this time, right?
I was already married. Yeah, I was married. My wife and I got married just after the police academy. And so, so we were already in the thick of it and worked through already. Here we are, 2 years or 3 years into marriage and transitioning careers already. It was like, it's an interesting thing to put on a 3-year marriage, pretty big upheavals.
Listen, the first 2 years of our marriage, how far do I go down this trail?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Well, when my wife and I, Terry, met, let's just say I wasn't thriving as a young man. And my in-laws were like, what is, I don't know about this. And anyways, by the time we're married, I've got a job as a youth minister, pretty stable full-time job. And so the respectability factor, for my in-laws in particular is there, and great relationship with them. They're the best people ever. But shortly thereafter, Terry and I feeling this call out of this kind of adventurous call to something, but not knowing all the answers. I leave a really good job, stability, to move to a new town, live in a hangar apartment. Like, this dude has a mansion, and out front, he's got an old barn that he uses for his airplane. Terry and I are staying in the room above it. Now, though he lives in a mansion, don't think that this is like an old barn that there was hardly any work done. And it's one of those moves where it's like, everybody looking on's like, what are y'all doing? But just the sense of,
I know those looks too. I know those looks. Yeah.
Just the sense of, though, but trusting and following the Lord, and things worked out. But anyhow, go ahead. Sorry.
That's it. No, it's it. And I resonate with you, brother. I really do, because I know those looks. I know those looks of like, hey, you need to kind of buckle down or get your act together, or something's going on, and I'm like, I'm trying to hang on to God's coattails as the best that I can, like white knuckling the whole way, okay. So we go to seminary, and it was at seminary. Now, listen, I think we've all been poor college students at some level, at some day, in some capacity. I didn't realize maybe how poor I was going to be.
That's a bit of God's grace.
Yeah.
Because even when sometimes when you're that poor, you don't even know you're that poor until later. Then you're like, how did we ever get by on what we had?
It's so true. And it's funny. I had 2 kids at the time too. There's 4 of us. And I was, as I look back now, it's funny how I always tell, the people in my church, like sovereignty is always easy to look in reverse, right? You can see sovereignty easily, but in the middle of it, man, when you're in the valley, it's like, what is happening? Right. But as I look back on that time, man, it was so formative. It was so, you never learn as well until you're in the fire, man. And that's where the change, you want to talk about the seminary of kind of like the Christian life or Christian worldview is going to be in trouble, in pain, in real challenge. So here we are, we're at seminary. We're dead broke. And I'm looking for work, but I have a full load of classes. And so you're trying to manage that. And I find that there's this job at the seminary and I'm like, perfect. I can take classes, work there, whatever. It just says podcast engineer. And I was like, hey, listen, I've never touched technology a day in my life, but listen, I can figure it out. Right. Cause I think we talked about, I have this serial issue that I think I can figure stuff out. Right. Which is almost like every young man's curse.
But even within that, there are those of us that have a little bit, we were given a bigger portion of that.
Yeah. And I don't think that it was at the arrogant level, try to be true to self-assessment, right. But I think it was just this sense of like, not only for my family, I'm going to figure it out, but I really have this sense that I think I can figure it out.
And a joy. There's a bit of that entrepreneurial spirit, which is like, right. I can figure this out and I'm going to enjoy figuring it out. And I'm going to enjoy bringing into existence something that wasn't before, just even in my own life, much less the thing that I'm actually going to create.
It's true. And it's like that hunter mentality. I'm hunting, man. And I'm able to, just really put my teeth into it. And it's served me like 90% well. There's been a couple 10%ers that have like, no, that didn't work. But okay. So I'm like podcast engineer. I'm your guy. I go and I apply for the job. For some strange reason, they give it to me. And it ends up being a job for the president of the seminary, who has, by the way, 2 national podcasts.
And Al Mohler.
Al Mohler, right? Dr. Albert Mohler. So I'm doing his 2 brief. So his 2 shows were called The Briefing and Thinking in Public. And now little Greg Koukl, who, by the way, a month and a half ago had never touched, barely a computer, is now Albert Mohler's podcast engineer. And I want to say engineer always in air quotes.
So did they know this? Was this like a big secret? Like,
listen, I was truthful. I just want to know. God is my witness. I did not pad any resume. I didn't do any of that. I was truthful.
I'm not saying you're lying. I'm saying there's a way to be truthful and not tell the whole story, right?
Yeah.
Gosh, is that what I would teach my kids?
You're bringing me back to police work. You're bringing me back to police work. It's like, yes, well, just because I can be honest doesn't mean I have to tell you and divulge all things. That's right. But no, I was, hey, this is who I am, but I'm a driver and I can, I got a family, et cetera. So anyways, I start in, which basically translated to on the ground for the first 3 months. I was terrified of my job every day that, he's interviewing these high level people and national figures. And I'm like, just please stay on technology. Just please stay on. Cause I got like 2 go-tos. If this shuts down, I got like 1 button I can push and I'm kind of out at that point. Right. But with that job came a partial kind of like videographer position that was like, hey, do some film too. And I was like, hey, I can figure it out. So yeah, I'll take it. Turns out that video came really naturally to me and kind of the storytelling angle that again, looking back, I can see it so clearly. In the middle of it, it just seemed like one little opportunity and I'll just take it because I need money. But again, God is so sovereign and that's the dust statement of any kind of, authentic Christian follower. But it's always the sovereignty in these seemingly mundane little details. And man, the tapestry that's being woven is fascinating when you look back. And so that's what was happening. And here we go. What was happening is that this storyteller was being birthed. Now I was already kind of, in one sense, you've been a pastor. I mean, we're storytellers at the preaching level, at some level, but a little bit different when you go into the digital space. And so
I don't know that there's any pastors out there that are good storytellers. Who are they?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a bit too cynical.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I know a couple, but yeah, I was going to say you, but I've heard you preach.
Well, but I don't even think when I was pastoring, I think I bought into this. Now, let me qualify all this. I think, hermeneutics is a valuable discipline. I think exegetical study is the way to do it, but exegetical study and preaching look too similar today, where pastors get up and they give basically an exegetical commentary on the passage. And I see a lot of story just left out. And you may get like a bunch of that's right, that's right, that's right, that's right, that's right. But it's disconnected from a grander story. And I think people walk out of these and they don't remember anything. So I think that the state of preaching today is, I don't know, in need of a reimagination, because you've got a lot of pastors out there that are just, they're theologically inaccurate. They're sloppy with their commitment to the word. They don't do the proper hermeneutical, they haven't been trained in any of that, much less even just a true commitment to that. And it's just self-help garbage. Well, then on the other end, you've got these faithful students of the word that really spend hours poring over this and even praying over this. And not to say that the other group I mentioned don't pray or whatnot, but then they come and they bring all of this exegetical work to their people. And it's a lot of work to have to go through. And in a setting where you don't have the opportunity to talk back and raise your hand and say, hey, what did you mean? It's a lot of work to then take notes and fill it in. It's very, very academic. And I think that work is appropriate. I just don't know that that's appropriate in a large gathering because of the diversity of the folks that you're going to have there, kids, adults, new believers, young, old believers, and the whole mix. I think that our Sunday morning sermons have to have much more of a story like quality to it that not only keeps people engaged, but it's allowing them to connect the truths, the golden nuggets of truth that they're hearing. They're connecting it to a story, and then they walk away and they have something that they remember and they can, just that they remember. So anyway, sorry, I'm interviewing you. You're not interviewing me. So
well, I mean, it is. But it is interesting because I think just to touch on that before I get back in the seminary, the idea being, without knowing God's entire story, God's a storyteller. And if we're made in his image, then we reflect that nature. We all love stories. Sit around any dinner table, you'll find that we all love stories. But you're right. When it gets into these other kind of venues, something changes. I talking with the men in my church, going through how to preach and how to do these different things for this kind of leadership, these few men that I'm really uniquely pouring into. And the idea being like, you got to land these planes, but you got to tell me a story because God's telling me a story. Is it possible? And I think what some people default to then is go topical because that seems to be more story oriented, which I think is then it destroys God's entire story. You'll never get the whole counsel of God in that setting. Right. And so yeah, there's pitfalls everywhere, right? There really is kind of you're walking in a minefield that you got to be real careful of. But I do think, we can recapture that story. That's kind of, again, what I think where God has brought me to is kind of really majoring back on the story. But speaking of that, let me get back into this and get to the main guts of, I think, your regular question, which is after seminary, I started getting into, I'm starting to do some film work. And then within the first year, here I am again, a videographer, podcast engineer, with about 6 months worth of tech experience. And then I start, I'm getting some traction. And then within the first year, they asked me to take over. So I'm now the productions manager of the seminary, which is crazy. And within the first year of this, now all of a sudden I'm this videographer, which I refused to call myself that for like 5 years because I was like, no, I'm a pastor. And yet, for whatever reason, I'm like doing this film on the side. And it was a massive struggle, kind of an identity struggle there for a bit. Actually, really strangely enough, I actually thought I was being unfaithful because I actually thought, listen, we're here to do the typical pastoral track, but yet I'm doing this over here because I got to feed my family. And so like, is God testing me to say like, hey, are you just going to willing to chase something shiny over here? Or are you going to, keep your nose and go? I really needed some men and I didn't have it back in that day. I really could have benefited from, some real godly counsel and kind of biblical theology and understanding how these things kind of work. But God let me go through it and push me out. Within the first year, I shot film in 13 countries. It was just like God was padding my resume. And now that's been, that was 2010. So what's that? 15 years ago. And I've been in professional film ever since. Now, what's cool about that, because inside of that, I always had theology is always my first love because I'm a pastor at heart. And I always had a big drive to do, missions work and to do even international missions. And always had a kind of a real burden for the Jewish people in general. And so long story short, because sovereignly speaking, again, is amazing because I had film experience. And then I also had, I was ordained as a minister and I had theological training. I was able to then get a visa into Israel and get a clergy visa, which is kind of, they call it the golden ticket in the visa world because it's a permanent visa, which is next to impossible to get. But I got one. And I went and taught film in Jerusalem at a film school. And so here we go. 4 of us, right? The 4 family members, we packed up, sold everything we've ever owned and left the United States with 6 suitcases and got on a plane and landed in Tel Aviv and, didn't speak any of the language, knew nothing and went right to Hebrew school, 3 rounds of immersion immersion Hebrew school. And started teaching film in Jerusalem.
And when was that? What year?
Oh gosh, so this would have been about 8 years ago now.
And you were there for how long?
I was there for just about 2 years. Yeah. Yeah, we had our son over there. My son named Abishai. We had a child over there. But we actually there's about a 12-year gap between my one son and our new son. And we had 3 miscarriages right in a row. And so we just kept having, it was such a terrible time because in all of that seminary time when we're barely making it, we're also having miscarriages like crazy and just couldn't keep babies alive. And it was just you want to talk about a devastating time. I think there's an old saying, I think it was Spurgeon that said it, that before God, uses a man, he wounds him deeply. And let me tell you, there was this kind of time of just, understanding Genesis chapter 3 in a different way, that this is a fallen world and it's hard. And, but then when we go to Jerusalem, God faithfully gives us a child, and Abishai in Hebrew, Avi is my father and Shai is gift. And so we called him a gift from my father. And so here we go. Abishai, by the way, if you ever have an opportunity to have a child in an international or a foreign medical system, I would go ahead and skip that one if I were you. It's not.
I'm not going to be able to have that opportunity.
Yeah. Any listener, I'd go ahead and skip that one. It was a big challenge. It was a big challenge. But
wow. So you're this is your adulthood and married life here is quite adventurous. Challenges, obstacles, profound loss and suffering. And all throughout, you've been talking about the sovereignty of God and how it's kind of easily seen and loved after the fact, not in the midst of it. Isn't this the gift of old men? And we're now old men, Greg.
So true.
And there's men older than us. And this is right? and women too, men and women. Their gift is telling us these stories.
Yeah.
That allow us to have a hopeful vision of life in general, but of what's to come and what we're dealing with now. So real quick, and I've got a million questions that I really want to ask you. It was fun doing just a little bit of prep this morning, thinking of what do I want to ask Greg about? And man, I think the most amount of questions poured out of me of any podcast so far. Your connection with Stand to Reason, Great Apologetics Ministry. How did you get connected with them? And again, just the weaving of this police officer, pastor, seminary, got to take a job, love videography, adventurous mind, missional mind, goes to Jerusalem, comes back. And I'm guessing it's when you come back that you get connected with Stand to Reason. And in apologetics, was this another job you were just taking, or how did this come together?
Great question. And no, it didn't happen when I got back. Basically, here's the issue with living overseas. You're all self-funded, right? Because you only, if you're a citizen of Israel is when you can take money from Israel. So you can't have a job in Israel. So to do the kind of the tent making scenarios, you have to be self-funded. So, we're working through that. Well, we started losing funding because, the funding world is like, up and down, up and down. And so, we had a visa issue because of that. And they were like, you're out. And zero there's zero redress. It's like, you have to leave. And so we had to pack up and leave the country. And in this moment of like, oh man, we're in this, again, almost cataclysmic like transition. What are we doing? I get, I'm starting to just look for work, and I had never heard of Stand to Reason. I don't know if this is a mark on me or a mark on them, but I had never heard of Stand to Reason before I applied for the job. And what's funny is that because I went to Cal Baptist University in Southern California, that's where Bible college was. And because of a guy in there, he was like, hey, they're looking for this video guy. And I'm like, hey, I'm a video guy. I can figure that out. And so they were like, yeah, just go ahead and apply. And so I applied, and I actually interviewed over Zoom in Jerusalem. And then they hired me while I was still there. And then I came back to a job. And that was, again, almost 8 years ago now.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, hiring Al Mohler's production guy. That makes a lot of sense. So has there been anything, and I've seen a ton of your work, probably not all of it. And of course you've done work for our organization, Apologetics Inc., and you do phenomenal work. Is there anything, any project, any film that you've done that's your favorite and why?
Yeah, it's a great question too, because film is such a diverse thing. When you say like, hey, I do film work, people automatically go feature film. Like, oh, you're doing it, and that's like a fraction, right? That's like saying I play sports and you go, oh, you're in, your Major League Baseball. Well, that's like this, percentage of a percentage, right? And so, most film work, like the muscle of film work, I did a lot of promotional film over the years, a lot of kind of commercials and that kind of thing. When you're learning how to craft a story or a narrative around, a particular product or an event or something. Recently, within like the last several years, I got into the documentary space as a documentarian. I love that space the most, probably the most.
What is it about that you love the most?
I'll tell you why, because like in an organization like, let's say Apologetics Inc. or Stand to Reason or whatever, you have a lot of necessary video that needs to be done, right? A lot of workhorse kind of video, like, okay, you gotta, teaching videos that are just, talking heads. You got to do these, like, these are all necessary, but in one sense, that's not storytelling, right? That's just me capturing a good, teaching piece or whatever, so that people can be really equipped or discipled. I'm not going to denigrate that, because that's really necessary. But when you're a storyteller, like, you want to creatively craft. I just don't want to make sure that my camera is like on and in focus. I want to make sure that I want to ex nihilo bring something out, right? I want to create something. And that's what documentary kind of film work lets you do. It's kind of, I always called it the poor man's, feature film, like poor man's cinema, because you can have a smaller budget, but you can really craft a narrative, right? And you can unpack a thing, whatever that thing is. And it is a mountain of work, but it's so it kind of scratches that itch of, how do I not only give you information? That's what film does, right? It passes information, but I can actually attach emotion to it, right? I can, we call it the Trojan horse all the time, by the way. In storytelling circles, it's always the Trojan horse mindset, which is, people always have, viewed the Trojan horse as a negative, right? Those guys got in and they killed everybody, or, a Trojan horse virus. That's always a negative. But really, all a Trojan horse is something that gets into your, inner circle without you realizing it. And then it kind of releases something. So you can do that in storytelling all the time. I can use comedy, or I can use, beauty to get, past your defenses. And then I can deliver the Christian worldview to you. But I mean, C.S. Lewis did this masterfully with Narnia. I mean, this is the idea is how do I get past those?
I mean, isn't it inevitable? Isn't that just like the nature of story? Is it? I mean, I guess I'm trying to imagine a kind of story where that's not its nature. Meaning, and so like the Trojan, because because here's what I was thinking about. Like, there's the there's the aim of the storyteller, right? Whether it's pure, dishonest, manipulative, or whatever. And of course, that's something to consider. But it's like, I don't know why I'm even bothering to mention this, I think, but that's kind of like just the nature of story, is that it seeps into the heart and the mind in a way where, well, it's like if it doesn't seep into the heart and mind, you're just not even listening. So it's like if you're hearing a story, that's its very nature, is it's going to penetrate and spread.
Right. And I mean, you had referenced the pastoral world, like the pulpits. And I would say what you just said is exactly the point. Like, deliver the words of life to me, but do it through the way that we've been DNA wired, which is story. God is a storyteller. We are storied beings.
Why do you suppose that is? That's such a, how are you going to answer that question? But
well, yeah,
it's like,
why did God choose to do it the way he does it? No, I'm not sure.
Right. So it's probably a dumb question. Let's move on. But, it's like, we love story. I think we orient ourselves in the world through story. Of course, that's Jordan Peterson's big thing right now. It's been it for a while.
Right. Well, let me go one step further. It's like, there's no such thing as a story that's neutral ever. Right. This is your point. I'm about this Trojan horse, is that it seeps in. But listen, every single storyteller, there's guys like me that are in these kind of creative spaces and creative meetings all the time. And all they're doing is they're thinking about you, your kids, and how do they conquer you with story. There is no such story that's just giving you information. It's trying to make you think their way. No neutrality. Ever. And so if that's true, right, and we have the Christian worldview, we have the story, then there's a greater obligation, I think, on the Christian, certainly the pastor. Oh, don't get me started on the obligation of the pastor to tell the right story and to tell it, I think, with the right conviction, because it's so necessary, and we have the words of life, and we're battling false narrative. We're battling false narrative everywhere.
All right, so maybe instead of asking why, it's just a fair recognition that the world is so ordered such that we are made as creative beings and storyteller and story lover kind of beings. What maybe it'd be very helpful here to define story, which seems maybe really elementary, but there's a side of this where you hear the word story and you think not real. Even when I was growing up in certain circles, there was a phrase like, oh, stop telling stories. And they meant like, be truthful. So, processing this to say God's a storyteller, we need to be storytellers. We orient ourselves in this world through story. We're obviously not meaning something that is false, made up in the fairy tale, not real sense. Or even
it's not once upon a time. Yeah.
Once upon a, so let's just maybe define our terms here. When we're saying story, what do we mean? And what do you mean?
Well, again, okay. So I think there's this inherent need. Let's kind of take it. I'm not trying to be roundabout, but I don't have a street definition, but we all have a street definition. That's the issue, right? But let me go roundabout for a minute. Everybody in the world today, I'm in this project right now called Your Story Revealed, right? This book that I'm writing, because the idea being, listen, everybody has this innate need to feel like their story, the way that they view the world, everything that is surrounding them, that it actually matters, that there's something above them or something greater. There's this inherent idea that this cannot be all that there is, right? From like, let's say my individual story, your individual story, what does it all mean? And I think the point of all of this is that God is telling one story of the universe. It started in Genesis. We don't think about the Bible like this anymore. This has been kind of, if a book starts, and I don't know if all do, but if a book starts from this idea of like, you're going to answer a problem, you're addressing an issue and you're going to unpack an issue, then one of the issues I was seeing was that we have lost the storyline of human history. Now, I don't mean historical dates. I mean, like, we have lost this idea of what is this grand purpose, what theologians call the meta narrative. What's this meta narrative idea of what story is being told? And if we can capture that storyline, then our story will make sense. But you cannot know, this is the point of my whole book, you cannot know who you are until the story that you belong to. Because if you don't know the story that you belong to, you'll just make up your own narratives, right? Because nature abhors a vacuum and you're going to fill in the details with something. And so,
that's good. Identity.
Yeah. And so this is, to
use
me,
another metaphor. It's like downstream from the story.
Right. And so when you think about, by the way, they always say that culture is downstream from the pulpit, right? And I agree that the church, this idea of the church has lost the storyline. We've kind of veered into this kind of topical preaching, and we've lost this whole storyline of what God's doing. And because of that, right, we're in a the irony of being in an information age, yet we're probably as dumb theologically as we maybe ever been. And so that's challenging to me. But the idea being, we have to recapture this storyline. And so one of my arguments has been, I don't know who you are. I don't have to know you personally, but I do know this. I do know your story. And I want to then unpack that story to you. God's telling a story about himself throughout all of human history. And there's everything of who you are is told through story. There's nothing that you've ever learned in your life that hasn't come down to you through a story. And so you know who you are through a story. I think when we get to our age, I have this drive. I'm assuming you do, but I have this drive now to like, what was my grandfather like? You know what I mean? What did he struggle with? There's this innate idea now of like, I want to know my story. The Cash family story, the legacy thing. There's this innate nature in all of us. I think why? Because we're made in God's image, and that's how God has created and ordered his universe. And so I'd like to talk to you at some point about this Your Story Revealed, but we can go further into this first.
Well, do you think that's a helpful question for people to ask themselves, parents to even ask their kids, or husband and wife? Just a good question to ask of yourself or someone else. Like, what is the story that you're listening to, and who's telling that story? If this is true, and I think there's actually wide acceptance of this idea now, where it's like the postmodernists got it right, that we fundamentally orient ourselves in life through a story. Now, the postmodernists said, but there is no inherent meaning to life, so all stories are power plays. Reject all of them, which is fine enough in a sense, but like in that vacuum, another story is going to emerge, whether you create it for yourself or that story. That point there in itself is a story that you're now operating by. So it's like story is unavoidable. And this is something maybe that people give too little attention to. So what is the story that I'm listening to? And then a really important question, who is the one telling that story? Yeah.
It's funny that as you're bringing that up about the postmodern mindset, it's completely self-contradictory. It's like saying, there's no absolute truth. Well, I mean, that statement alone, there's at least one absolute truth, isn't there? I mean, in that kind of, self-contradictory claim. And so to say there's no story is, you can argue that, try to philosophically or whatever, but listen, it's absurd. It's absurd at the most fundamental level. And everybody down to my 7-year-old little Avishai, listen, you would have a long day to convince anybody of that. Everybody knows that their story. The question is what you just said. I think that's the point, is who gets to tell the story, right? Who has kind of the authority of the story? So we would say, by what standard? What story is there a story that actually not only is higher than you, but actually has authority over you? Authority is a real question here in terms of story, because the idea of being, in a Darwinian evolutionistic or atheistic or postmodern world, I get to be the definer of my own story. So I get to define what's right for me. I get to define all these things, right? What I'm saying is I am the standard. I'm the sovereign in my universe. That's the story that I'm creating. The problem is, the question that we would ask is, okay, that's an answer. The question is it a true answer? And by the way, we've gotten all the way to the back. When you do that, this is what I always tell my kids. When you do that, we're evaluating story all the time, right? My fear as a father for my own children and my own wife is that you will be duped. You'll be duped by the wrong story. And so I'm constantly trying to be, a pastor in my home first, before I'm a pastor of a church, pastor in my home, to say, listen, we need to be oriented to the story, that's actually true. And anybody who comes in and wants to be the sovereign, most pastoral counseling sessions I've ever been a part of, I'm saying, hey, you're in the wrong story. You're creating a narrative and it's not true. In fact, you're going right back to Genesis chapter 3. I mean, think about this. what is the issue in Genesis chapter 3? Don't eat this fruit. And if you do, you're going to die. And Satan comes in and says, you too can be like God. And what does that even mean, to be like God? Because the issue is they're already like God, right? They're already made in his image. So what does he mean when he says like God? Well, he's saying you can be the one to determine right and wrong. You can be the one. You can be. And listen, every sin you have ever been a part of, every sin I've ever been a part of is that issue. There's a mutiny in the Garden of Eden, and I'm taking part in it. I'm trying to be like God, and I'm going to be, you know what? God says not to do this thing, but I don't care. I'll do it. And so my point is, that's all story-based. That's all story-based. Any issue that you see in apologetics world is going to fundamentally go back to the story. And is it accurate with the story that God's telling? And so story is essential.
How would you describe what is the story that God is telling? And then a follow-up question is going to be, what do you think are some of the other prominent stories, counterfeit stories, if you will, that are being told that people are buying into?
Okay. So I'm going to preface this. This is my favorite discussion. Okay. So so you might have to cut me off. Okay. Cause I get to this almost soapbox moment where I start to, I realize this happens to be in the pastoral world, continually, where I'm saying I didn't breathe for the last 25 minutes.
Appreciate this self-awareness in you. I have it in myself, and all people do is make fun of me. So I will take the liberty to mock you and make fun of you at some point.
Well, hey, then, you really are, brother, because I do appreciate that. That's my love. That's my love language, truly. Okay. So the story, what I've often said is that God is continually telling a story about himself. The point of the entire universe is God's glory. And if that's true, this is why it's so critical to start with God, don't start with man, right? That God does everything for man. God does, we've kind of crafted this in evangelical circles where heaven is about, me not experiencing pain anymore or getting to see loved ones it's left out in that, Christ and the glory of God. And, or are my pets going to be in heaven? I mean, that's almost it's a discussion that it's hard for me to even take seriously, though I try to, because people are in different places. But the idea being it's laughable, not condescendingly, but it's laughable when you compare it to the glory of God, right? God comes in and he decides, what universe am I going to create? Okay, I'm going to create this universe that showcases my glory, right? So he does this. Garden of Eden. And then what happens? A mutiny happens in the Garden of Eden. And I don't like to call it the fall, because I think the fall lessens. We love to use these words that lessen what really goes on. So there's a mutiny in the Garden of Eden. Why a mutiny? Because Adam and Eve were told, this is how you operate in my world. And they want to be the deciders of truth. That's the temptation. They buy into it. And then what happens? They want to take God off of his throne, and they want to take it for themselves, right? This is the mutiny of the Garden of Eden. The mutiny takes place. God does what he says he's going to do, expels them. Now there's separation. God created human beings to be together, but now there's a separation. And then the rest of the story is this whole idea of how do we bring back human beings to live with God again? That's the entire story of the Bible right there. And because why? Because we were made in his image. We're not made like the rest of his creation, and image bearers are made to live with God. The issue is right now we're not living with God, right? Primarily. So then how does he answer that mutiny? And the key verse in this reality is Genesis 3:15, right? This idea of I'm going to put enmity, right? Even as he's unpacking the curses, he's unfolding the curses. He gives this glimmer of hope, which is why theologians again call it the first gospel, right? Genesis 3:15 being that I'm going to put enmity between you, the serpent and the woman, and then one day a descendant of this woman is going to crush your head. So we have this just like a good storyteller. Think about this: if this were a movie.
Here.
This is a movie, the ominous music is playing right now, right? All this stuff, and then there's this moment of but something's going to happen. We don't know Jesus on the cross yet, but we know something's going to happen. And then what does God do? He starts to unpack the structure of his story is told through covenants. So boom, we start after the mutiny. What do we see? Does sin remain small after the Garden of Eden? No, it spreads like a wildfire. Think about this. The first one is disobeying about a fruit. The second recorded sin is murder. I mean, like now all of a sudden image bearers are killing image bearers. Genesis chapter 4. It's the next Adam's sons. It just is a cancer that spreads. It spreads to such an extent that God now is going to do a complete reset. Genesis chapter 6, right? We'll get into the flood narrative. And God, in his grace, he doesn't have to. In his grace, he chooses Noah, makes a covenant to then sustain his image bearers, sustain humanity as God subjects the entire world to a catastrophic flood, right? So God makes the world a graveyard, as it were. After that, God then continues on into his narrative. The tension of this story starts to build. And what is happening? God is now going to call a people to himself, an actual people, and he's going to make a covenant. He does this with Abraham, and he comes in and says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. I'm going to make your name great, make you a great nation, and all of the world will be blessed through you. Why? Because we're trying to get back to Eden. This is the whole point. We're trying to get back to Eden. So God systematically starts doing this, right? And then we have all that, the Abraham and Isaac. There's a ton of foreshadowing that happens in all of these narratives, right? I don't have time to go into all that. Just trying to stick to
and this story in Genesis is about God's, part of it, God's grace and mercy to this family, and how through this family's abundance will come a blessing to the whole world. And even in the midst of this, they screw it up royally.
Completely. Well,
completely, utterly. In horrific ways.
We could go back to Noah and say the same thing. The entire world gets like a Control-Alt-Delete, right? If that's still a reference we use anymore. It gets a complete reset. And you have this, think about Noah. If we're talking about character association in a film or in a story, Noah emerges from the ark as an Adam-like character. He's like, in one sense, a new Adam coming out of this new created earth, right? Creation, decreation, recreation themes happen in scripture all the time. And then what does he do? God reestablishes the covenant with Adam. Be fruitful and multiply. He establishes that with Noah. And by the end of the story of Noah, Noah's completely failed. He's a drunk shipbuilder who is completely depraved. Is he going to be the one that is going to be the seed of the woman that crushes the serpent's head? No, disqualified, right? We go into Abraham. Is Abraham going to be the one? No, disqualified. Right? Is Isaac going to be the one? Why does God stop the sacrifice of Isaac? Because he's insufficient. He is not an adequate sacrifice. Why? God himself has to provide the sacrifice. And so we keep marching in this way. God calls his people to himself, and he's going to use this people as the beacon to get the rest of the world. And then he brings his people to Mount Sinai through Moses, through this massive Exodus story, which is powerful. And then he's going to make them a holy priesthood. Okay, I'm going to make you an actual priesthood that's going to go between me and the nations, and you're going to go and reach these nations. Does Israel succeed? No, they fail. Does Moses succeed? Yeah. Does Moses succeed? No, Moses can't even enter the promised land. He fails. And so we have to have Joshua take us in the promised land. And by the way, view the promised land in view of the whole story, which is, this is an Eden-like scenario. You're entering into a land again, right? Eden is very centered on land because that's why they were expelled from it. They're entering into land again where God is going to dwell with them. And so it's like an Eden-like scenario, but the problem is there's still sin in the world, so there's barriers. It wasn't like Eden. Eden was barrier-free. Now there's barriers, but God is systematically getting closer to living with his people again. And what do we find? Israel fails miserably. You get into the prophets, you get into the judges, you get in all these times of the kings. We do that. But then God calls what? God calls a man to himself, a faithful king, right? Certainly not perfect in King David, far from perfect, but he is found to be faithful ultimately. And God says to him, I'm going to establish your kingdom forever, right? Davidic covenants is a significant covenant in 2 Samuel 7. And so this idea of being that in God's storyline, right? We have the covenant of works, right? Which is in, the Garden of Eden where the mutiny takes place. After that, we have God displays in the Noahic covenant his wrath against wickedness. God is serious about wickedness. He'll flood the entire earth. Right? His wrath is at the level of an ocean that covers the entire world.
And why is wickedness? It seems like a dumb question. So bad. And maybe you get what I'm asking here. Like a lot of times we view wrongdoing and sin as like, seriously, a flood? Why is wickedness something to be purged and hated? And is all wickedness equal? And you get what I'm asking? Well, it's like in some sense, when you're talking about heaven, we have a diminished view of God and his glory. Equally, it seems like we have a diminished view of sin and its horror. But why is sin so bad?
Well, I would actually ask the question another way. Why, how holy is God? Because again, the question that I think we don't start with is God. When we start with human beings, we ask questions that are, that seem to go like, there's an overreaction. Like I've heard this said within the flood. That's a radical overreaction. Like you're talking, if you think about this on the practical level, I always tell my kids, read the Bible with your five senses, like try your best to get into these ideas. That means there was infants in cribs somewhere on this earth when those floodwaters came, right? I mean, you're talking radical devastation. This is not, it's ironic that most churches or, children's ministries have, the flood narratives, painted. I mean, this is one of the most horrific scenes in the entire Bible. If you think about the devastation, right? But I think that it coincides directly with the kind of God who is holy. And here's this, Paul Washer said this really famously, that one of the worst news for a guy like you and a guy like me, right? Guys who were born into the guy who did the mutiny in the Garden of Eden. And that's the key, is that God could have executed Adam and Eve on the spot and he would have done them no wrong. But he chose not to, and he chose to give them mercy. But Paul Washer's argument was, the worst news for you and me today is that God is good, right? Because we're not. And that's the issue. When you start with God's holiness and God's goodness and his majesty and his righteousness, then we wouldn't ask the same questions. But when we start with men and we go like, listen, I'm not perfect, but me and Mike, we're just trying to do our best. Why is God just doing it? No, we've started in the wrong location, right? We've started the narrative in a different location. And because of that, we've made false conclusions. And I think that you see God's radical holiness that comes in, his impossible standards of holiness. And we are corrupt. We are evil. We don't like to talk in these languages anymore. We call it shaming or whatever, but it doesn't change any of the reality. We are an evil, mutinous people at heart. We need that rescue. And
when you say another word to define holiness, it's, word maybe it's so familiar, it becomes unfamiliar. What do you mean when you're referencing God holiness? What is it that you're talking about? Yeah.
When I think of holiness, I'm saying, God's ultimate standard of living, right? So when I think about how does God say we should live in our world? Because we always have to say, what does it mean to be good? What does it mean? We have to define all these words, because who gets to say what's holy and who gets to say what's right? Who gets to say what's good? I mean, I know you do a lot of space inside of the abortion world and all that kind of angle. Like, who's to say that's bad? Who's to say? Like, you have to establish standards. By what standard and who has authority? Does the woman and the doctor have authority? Do I have authority? Right? If this horrific thing is happening, who gets to say it's good or bad? Well, you have to go into God sets the standard for all these things. So God has laid out how he views sin, his holiness, and his set apartness in the sense of perfection and his perfect standard. And we don't meet that. No, I mean, we don't even have an ability to meet that outside of God's rescue. And so this is the idea of why would God's wrath ever come? Well, because we're evil. And we don't like to think of ourselves like that because it sounds like you're just so negative or something, but we're trying to stay true to the story here, right? It's just like a doctor diagnosing a terminal illness. You can't go for a cure unless you have the real horror of the mutiny. If you want to minimize the disease, then you're not going to run to a cure. So I think the story wants to always tell you the disease. The issue is, and this is Paul Washer's argument, was that God's goodness is the issue, right? God, I mean, you think about the Exodus account, we briefly touched on it. I mean, the Passover reality was God's wrath was coming to kill everybody. We always think about it just being the Egyptians. No, it was going to come and kill everybody, all the firstborns, Hebrew or Egyptian. How do you get outside of his wrath? You get under that blood, right? Jesus came not to save you so that you can, go to heaven, and not that, that's not the primary goal. The primary goal was to stand in the gap because God's wrath is coming, right? And that's the story. And so it's this but it's this story that's not it's full of grace and mercy. This is because it's not owed to us. This is, I think, the issue that we should always major on, is that when you look at all these covenants and this kind of covenantal arc that's happening throughout all the scriptures, none of it is owed to us. This is all mercy. God, the moment Adam and Eve sinned, he should have, in terms of justice, wiped out the entire human race. Done. Guilty, justice. But he decides to give mercy, and then he even decides to reveal himself progressively through these covenants and reestablish relationship, which, by the way, by the time we get into the Davidic covenant, he's established this king and he says, hey, there's going to be this throne that lasts forever. The problem after the Davidic covenant is that Solomon, all those guys after that, they all fail. And it just dives off a cliff. And what does God do? He does the same thing he did with Genesis chapter 3. He removes them from the land. He expels them. Right. So this whole idea, by the time Christ comes on the scene, we have every single covenantal head, every single person that was a hopeful seed of the woman who's going to crush the head. They've all failed. We need someone who can come. Yeah. And what do we got to do? Well, but here's the issue. God will have a people for himself. This is how God decided for his universe. And so what does he do? He makes a covenant with his son to say, go and get my people. And I want you to go and live the life they could never live. You got to go be better than Moses, right? You got to be the new Moses. You got to be the new Adam. You got to be you got to be this guy that's going to not only be a prophet, a priest, and a king, because all the prophets in Israel have failed. All the priests, all the kings, they've all failed. And so Jesus comes in and he is the embodiment of every single covenant, right? Think about this, the covenant with Noah, God's wrath against all the wickedness. Jesus absorbs God's wrath for the wickedness of the world, right? You think about Abrahamic covenant, where we have that God will make, call a people to himself and make them into a great nation. Jesus is going to call a people to himself, and he's going to make them into a holy priesthood, which is the Mosaic covenant. And then he's going to bring them into a kingdom that will never end. That's the Davidic covenant. Jesus is the embodiment of God's entire covenantal story. And it's because of his perfection, right? Because of his ability to succeed where all the others failed, right? The curse of sin and death had no claim on him. So when he dies, God reverses it, right? And we had talked about this before. One thing I always want to mention, when you think about the entire storyline arc, and this is the key, when Genesis 3 happens, you have what? The curses are starting to be handed out. Okay. You have, hey, women, Eve, you're going to get increased pain, childbirth. Hey, serpent, you're going to crawl on your belly, right? Dust of the earth, all that. Adam, you are going to, the land that used to provide for you and do all this stuff easily is now going to come with thorns. And what happens when Jesus comes through? And he not only assumes bodily all of these kind of covenantal, realities in his life and in his passion. What does he do? He goes and faces God's wrath, just like the Passover lamb. He's going to go and be the barrier between God's wrath. He's going to assume what is owed to us, but he wears a crown of thorns on his head. He takes Adam's curse and he puts it on his head, and he goes and faces the wrath of the Father. And so he's undoing. This is the entire storyline. And here's the issue. When we lose the story, because you and I, Mike, we're living in the new covenant era, right? I hate it when people, it's just a pet peeve. I hate it when people separate like Bible times versus modern times. And I understand what they're saying. Like there was a time when the Bible was being written and all that. No issue with that. But my point is, there's no separation in God's mind. He's telling one story. Right. And you and I, Mike, we're in this story right now. God decided that we would live in the new covenant era. And so we're in this story right now. And so we have to understand what came before us, this mutiny that happened in the Garden of Eden, and it was fully accomplished. What was separated was now brought back together through Christ, who wore our curse on his head to go face the Father's wrath, so that now Mike Sherrard can go and say, I don't plead my righteousness because I'm the mutinous guy in the Garden of Eden. I have to look to another. He wore my thorns for me. And I look to him. And so when I say, I don't even have to know you, I know your story, Mike. That's your story. And so when you live your individual life, right, you've been assigned to live a life, a certain circles. I say your job, the thing that God has given you the ability to do, is to make a contribution with your story into this larger narrative that he's been telling about himself for all of human history. That's why I'm writing the book called Your Story Revealed. That's the point.
So I am one who has been made in God's image, designed to know him through a relationship, given the calling to have dominion over what he has created. So meaningful work. I'm to do this in the joy of companionship and friendship. But because of the mutiny and the rejection of God's ways, sin entered this world and spread like a cancer, such that rather than love my brother, I would literally kill him, is in the story of Cain and Abel. And then the story that God has been telling is one of reclaiming his people through covenants. They have failed miserably. His son comes to conquer sin and death, taking the curse of man upon his head, and then giving man his spirit, enabling us to live as the image bearers that we were made to be. And so even though sin is still not finally eradicated, we have these first fruits, right? That the first taste here of what it's like to live in that Eden again, with our relationship restored to God and man, and where we can pursue God's glory by seeking the good of our neighbor in a multitude of ways. And in that, I have the confidence and the assurance that my life is meaningful. It is valuable, not because of what I do, but because of what I am, a man made in the image of God. And all my work is noble and dignified and glory and just noble when I do it for God's glory and the good of others. That's the story that I'm a part of and living out. And it's a wonderful story.
It's an incredible story that you could never write. You would never write it this way. You know what I mean? Like if you had to sit down and think about a world story, you would never think about a sacrificing Messiah, any of these kinds of things where God would enter his own creation as a man and do these things. And here's what I would say on the pastoral level, what this frees me up to do. So let's say you're one of my, church members and you're having trouble in your marriage, or, let's just use that as an example. It's kind of a common example. The first thing I want to say, as and in grace and in gentleness and in love, all of those attributes, but to say, let's get back to the story. Listen, you veered off the story where you've started to think that you're the main character. And therefore, because you want to be the main character, this is our issue, right? The mutiny in the garden is really me trying to be the main character of the story. And so I'm saying you've done that. Let's reject that. Let's get away from that. Let's get back to the storyline. And let's see, as let's say in your case, as a married Christian man, your role is to mimic God allowed you to be a living example, kind of a dress rehearsal of the type of marriage that he will then marry his bride with, right? So you're supposed to be a picture. So I can kind of tap into the story and say, no, we've missed the narrative, Mike, and you're creating a false narrative. Let's reject that, brother. Let's lay that down right now. Let's lay that down. You could go to the other side and say, LGBT stuff. Okay, fine. What have you done? You've left a narrative and you've created a false narrative in your whole mind. And I'm just here to tell you that that's not the narrative that you're living in. And you are continuing in the mutiny of the Garden of Eden. And I'm here to say, please repent and believe, right? Please repent and believe. And so I mentioned at the beginning that I have a list of questions that are longer than I've had for any guest. And I should have known better than to create a list so long when I'm talking to a storyteller. So sorry. Yeah, sorry.
There's nothing to apologize. So I'm trying to think through in the short remaining time we have here, because I'm no Joe Rogan. We're not going for 3 hours.
And I'm no Wesley Huff either. Yeah.
Man, that's, sorry. Well, no, guys, you're going to take me on a,
I don't.
We're in a unique moment, man. We really are.
Can I say one more thing about kind of the manhood talk? I know that we've had this talk because this is a big issue with me. And I don't want to go too far into those weeds, but like one of the biggest issues that we're seeing right now, right? Because there's this rejection of kind of, liberalism or whatever. We're seeing these like upticks, these new resurgence of kind of masculinity. And I want to be, and it comes from guys
Andrew
like
Tate's.
The Andrew Tates of this world, right? Exactly. And the Rogans and maybe the Petersons and even the Ben Shapiro's and these guys that are finally just willing to say, no, this is lunacy, whatever the issue. Like we're seeing lunacy and we're going to stand up and say it. But the problem is, what are they delivering you to? So masculinity outside of the Christian worldview, outside of these biblical boundaries, and why specific to the Christian worldview? Because that's the universe God created. Then outside of that, untethered to that, will lead to just nothing but abuse. There's no other option.
So
because
did I tell you that? I mean, I just gave a talk 2 Mondays ago or so. The title was Stewarding Masculinity, Rediscovering Men's Role in God's Design. And the talk was given for the exact reason you had said. Men in the West, at least the United States, for a solid decade of hard pressure, but going back even more than that, have been told, don't be a man. There's nothing important about being man. The only thing significant about a man is the toxicity that flows from their masculinity. And under this banner of toxic masculinity, you had a number of things that you would say, yes, that's vile, that's evil. No man should act like that. But then there were a number of things that just get thrown into this that are just normal things about being a man. Anyways, for the last 10 years, really hard, there's been this pressure, don't be a man. I think that pressure's over. I think that that element of the woke movement, even if the whole woke movement isn't over, that part, I think it's done. And there's a number of reasons that I think that, but we won't get into that. But we're seeing exactly what you described. The rise, the prominence of these male figures and their vision of masculinity and their call to it, and to varying degrees. What I fear is not just a description of toxic masculinity that was in the past, but a prescription of actual toxic masculinity. Right. And so today I think men need a vision of what does it mean to be a man and how do I live that out in God's story. And gave that talk a couple of weeks ago. Man, did it hit home. Person came to know the Lord through it, but it's one of the, it's another piece to this story, this puzzle story here or whatever that we've got to tell, because men need to have a vision for what is unique about my manhood and masculinity, and have that vision so that they don't follow these false teachers and ultimately not experience the kind of joy that comes from living as a man made in God's image.
That's right. That's right. And man, I created that talk, Your Story Revealed, for that exact reason, to say, I can tell you God's entire story in one setting, and kind of in a systematic way, and then also your story within it. And,
so
and
tell
the
me,
idea, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, maybe with the remaining time we've got, tell me a little bit more about Your Story Revealed. You mentioned you wanted to get into that. Why don't you dive into that here?
Yeah, it's understanding God's entire story, because that's the only way that I am going to know who I am, right? As a man, as a father, you name the scenario, you name the circle. That's the only way I will rightly know. Now, again, atheists will, we always use atheists as the example, but I mean, they'll create a narrative, but that doesn't mean it's true to reality. And so one of the things with Your Story Revealed is, how do I teach? And it started with my church. How do I teach my people that God has kind of entrusted to me to train and to disciple? How do I teach them not just parts of the Bible? This is where now hear what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. This is what chapter and verse has done a disservice to us. I'm a fan of chapters and verses, right? But that's a late addition to the Bible. The Bible, there was no such thing as chapters and verses for most of
one of the things
church.
I love, by the way, is I think they're called like a reader version of the Bible. They don't have chapter and verse. When I bought one of these, a set of these, I don't know, 5 years ago, it was like I'd never read the Bible before in my entire life. It's amazing. If you don't have one of these, go get one of them. It's amazing.
It's true. Because you think about, there's no such thing as, John 3:16. There's John. And so he's crafting an entire story. And so what we've done is because of chapter and verse, which is incredibly handy in terms of turn to this section.
Reference, right.
But it's also, let me put, Jeremiah 29:11 on my fridge and my grandma, and all this kind of stuff. And then I compartmentalize this Bible, and what happens inside of that? You lose the entire story. You lose the story because you don't even view it as a story anymore. You view it as a collection of sayings. And so when you do that, you will then lose what it means to be a man. It'll just be these, my champion, what we call fortune cookie, theology. And I don't want that. And that's not how God made us to be. What Your Story Revealed is trying to address is to say, can I know God's entire story without being without being an academic, without being can the average person know God's entire story? Yes, because I can understand the overall structure like a storyteller from the covenants mindset. So Your Story Revealed is just, how do I track with God's covenants and then understand all the storyline within that framework. It's a grid that I can see all of reality through now, right? When I say I live in the new covenant, well, what does that assume? What does that mean? What's the backstory of me living in the new covenant? And I want to, as I was doing with my church people, is I want to train you in God's entire story. And then inside of that, once you own the story, you'll know your story. And then your life will have this entire new lens that which you see all of reality, through. And without that story, you'll create your own story, which is what happens in Genesis 3.
All right. I got 2 questions for you. First one's not a fair question to ask at the end because its answer is probably its own podcast, right?
Uh-oh.
But just in light of this conversation, I'm curious what advice you would have for pastors, particularly that are hearing this and they go, how do I use what I'm hearing here about story in pastoral care or in preaching, right? It's like, some books of the Bible make it a little bit more easy. Like you're going to go through Ruth,
right.
And again, going back to this reader version, when I read Ruth for the first time without chapter and verse, I was captivated by that story. It gripped my heart in ways that it never had before. I saw things I never had before. And then if there was ever, you had mentioned earlier about story and preaching, if there was ever a series that I did that probably had that it was probably Ruth. And so Ruth kind of sets itself up to have more story-like qualities to it in preaching. But thinking about some of the other books of the Bible, like Acts, for example. I mean, Acts is probably a bad example because that is a pretty good narrative story there. But some pastors may be hearing this and going, okay, I've been trained, I went to seminary, hermeneutics, exegetical work. I've got my commentaries. I see my 3 theological insights that I want. I've got my practical steps for application. And I help you understand what this verse means. I give you the theological insight, and then I give you the practical application there. And it's bullet points, lecture format. It sits well in a classroom kind of environment. It's like, I think they lack both an example because there's just not a ton of preachers out there that do this. So they lack that example, but then they lack I don't even know what would it mean to craft a sermon that's, the heart of it is, maybe heart's even the wrong analogy here, but it's undergirded and infused with this robust hermeneutical, exegetical work, but it's delivered with some elements of story. What, again, not a fair question to ask at the end. So answer it meaningful, but not in 40 minutes.
In Twitter amount of characters. So there's a lot there. Let me think about this. When you say, by the way, most of the time what we've said is, whenever you get new seminary grads, you got to get the seminary off of them right away. And it really is true. Not in the sense of robust, training and study, but in the sense of, in the sense of even just people interaction and just, so there is that. What I would say to a pastor, and by the way, most pastors that I've ever dealt with, certainly in Missouri, but even in California, a lot of them did not go to seminary. I think there's this misconception that most pastors go to seminary. I don't think that's true.
Right, sure.
I think there's a portion, so what I would tell to those guys is those guys seem to collect a bunch of their kind of, they become kind of fanboys, which isn't all bad. I like this guy, and then I watch them and then I want to try to talk like them. That would be number one. I would say God's called you. Don't try to be a regurgitator. That's number one. Number two, in the story angle, you have to read a lot of the Bible. And that sounds like such a duh statement, but here's what I see when pastors start to craft a sermon. Okay, let me get my MacArthur, commentary, and I'm going to see what John said about this, and then I'm going to go into this, and then I get these other things, and then I craft my point. Like you said, like I'm just going to get the guts of it done. And I'm saying, if you're going to teach on, let's say, John chapter 6, read the entire Gospel of John. Like, why wouldn't you consume? I'm telling my people at the church, consume large chunks of the Bible. Like, don't look at the chapter and verse and make you think I just got to do a chapter a night. That's our kind of regimented mindset. No, so this is for the layperson, but at the pastoral level, like, listen, you've been called to be a shepherd. You have to know God's entire story. And so if that's true, you need to consume large chunks of the Bible because it is a story. If your wife, Mike, wrote you a letter that was a 5-page love letter, you wouldn't be like, hey, turn to page 4, line 7, And by the way, memorize that line. Wow, what did that mean to your life, Mike? Nobody would do it that way, but with the Bible, we do, because we've kind of separated this idea. And so I think that there's this idea of you need to understand and kind of consume large parts of the story. But then I think that it is helpful. This is why it's going to sound self-serving, but I do think the covenants are the grid that you can understand the entire storyline, right? Just like in my world, in the digital film world, we have acts and different acts that are different parts of these kind of larger stories. So we would say act 1, act 2, act 3, fine. But that's what the covenants are. So if I'm going to say, hey, I'm reading in, I don't have to know every single book of the Bible and what it even each entails. I'm going to read the book of Hosea. Well, the first thing I want to know is, what covenant are we in? Okay. Am I in Mosaic covenant time period? Am I in between the Davidic? Am I after Davidic? Well, what does that mean? That's going to mean something significant, right? The storyline and the tension is building. And then I read Hosea inside of this grid. The grid is essential to understand where you're at in the story and then to pick it up right there. You can't read all 66 books at every time. So we have to be able to pick it up where we're at in the story. That to me has been the most transformative thing in my personal life. Yeah. And then within my church, for sure.
Yeah, me too. I give the same advice all the time. And I hate the word chunks. So I use the word portions. Read the Bible in larger portions. But that's the biggest thing that's transformed my understanding of the Bible, is just learning to read more of it. Yeah. And so I think for preachers, it's like the question, how, in any individual sermon, how do I do that for my people? I don't have the time to read a ton, although I'm always surprised. I heard a pastor one time make a comment about how some scholars think that the book of Hebrews was constructed as a sermon. And then the joke was, can you imagine how long of a sermon that would be? And I was like, you know what? I'm not going to imagine. I'm going to find out. And how many words are in the book of Hebrews? I do that. Average words spoken per minute. The book of Hebrews, if you just read it out loud, would have been shorter than that pastor's sermon.
Oh, right.
And so it's like, so I was about to say, you can't just read the book, the entire letter of, 1 Timothy, every sermon. It was like, actually, you know what? You actually could. It's like maybe 2,000 words.
You could easily.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and again, not even prescribing I'm not prescribing anything here, but to some degree, pastors have got to zoom out and zoom in every sermon. And and most pastors get this, like they get the don't ever read just a Bible verse. They get the context, but not just even the context of the chapter. It has to be the context of that letter. But then it's like, if you're going through the Pauline epistles, what is Paul doing through all of his pastoral epistles? What is Paul doing through Timothy? And how does this fit in with what God is doing? I think every sermon has to have some element of that, so people don't just get, locked, so blinded by all they see are these theological insights and moral applications. And then moralism is what kind of emerges from even sound exegetical preaching. And then you lack a vision for, how do I even implement this? It becomes a burden. People aren't remembering this. Biblical worldview is continuing to decline. It's not getting any better. And I really think the missing piece here is story. And so I'm still trying to figure this out too, man. And I'm not a practitioner like I once was, where I'm preaching every Sunday. So I hope everything I'm saying here comes with a bit of humility. And what would I do if I were preaching every week? Would be probably making a mess of it. but
it's funny. I don't buy a lot of the excuses we give. Like, I don't have time to read. No, we do. We do for sure. Mm-hmm. You do the thing that you value the most. And if you're a pastor, listen, you're a shepherd of God's people. You're his mouthpiece uniquely. And listen, God takes that incredibly seriously, and you better too. And so that's a really critical, I think, weighty thing. I think we should feel the appropriate weight of the position that we're in. That's just number one. But also there's a standing joke in my church of like, if we ever don't know an answer to a question, just say Genesis 3:15, because like I talk about Genesis 3:15 so much, because if you talk about Paul, okay, we have these epistles where he's making a particular argument to Timothy or whatever, fine. Then you have to see that in view of the larger New Testament canon. Okay, fine. You also have to see that in a larger view within the New Testament, New Covenant. Okay, fine. But then what is Paul thinking? Like, Paul's an Old Testament quiet time reader. Okay, so then where he's coming from an entire old covenant mindset, because why? He's writing the documentation for the new covenant. So he's coming from an Old Testament covenant mindset. And so we have to be, here's the spoiler. Everything goes back to Genesis, and I don't want to ever make really overgeneralized comments, but I promise you would be hard pressed to find almost anything that doesn't go back to Genesis, because that's the issue that's being solved. That's the issue. It's always, how does man live with God again? And so when Paul's talking about the church, well, of course, these are the final stages of being with God again and his people and his bride, and before we have full consummation. And so it's all Genesis. I mean, it's hard not to give the entire story of the Bible every sermon, because that's the whole point. That's the point, So I think reading more is essential. I see this, by the way, a lot. Last thing I'll say about this, I see this a lot in the apologetic circles, uniquely parachurch, which I have some other reservations about. But and that is, read a lot of philosophy, read a lot of philosophers, read a lot of Christian thinkers. And I don't see as much reading of big chunks of the Bible. And I'm like, you've got to read the story, right? Yes, God has given us incredible teachers and incredible, insightful men and women, no question, but read the Bible, right? I mean, you need to own that text. And I don't mean chunks. I mean the entire story.
Yeah.
It's too important. So.
Hey, really good, Greg. Maybe we should do Joe Rogan style here, because there's a lot more to talk about. Last question. This is something new. I'm going to try it on for size. First time I've done this, I'm straight up stealing this idea, man. Just straight up stealing it. But I'm going to give credit. Stephen Bartlett, The Diary of a CEO Guy podcast book. He does this, and I thought this was beautiful. So no shame. That's where I got this from. I'm just going to do it. Now, you have no idea who the next guest is, but I want you to ask them a question that I'm then going to ask them, and I'm going to carry this on. That just seemed so fun to me. And I'm going to, so thank you, Stephen, to do this.
Did I get asked a question from somebody?
No, because you're the first one, man. You're the first one I'm starting this with. So I want you to get the ball rolling here, and you have no idea who the guest is. What question do you want to ask them? Oh, I got to write this down. I got to get my pen out, and I'm going to ask them, and I'm going to keep this going unless it turns out to be stupid and only Stephen Bartlett could do it for some reason. Or I get a cease and desist and trademark this idea, copyright this idea.
No kidding. No kidding. Yeah.
I feel like Phil, what's his name that trademarked three-peat in the NBA? Well, I can't.
Sorry. You're talking to the least sports-oriented guy besides.
I'll blurt it out in a minute. Pat Riley. That's who did it. Oh, hey, go ahead. Sorry. What question you want to ask?
If somebody asked you, well, let me say it this way. Let me think out loud for a minute, and then we'll kind of craft this, because I have a kind of a broader picture, but to not ask like a 3-paragraph question. I would want someone to, which is what I ask a lot of people, is if somebody came to you and your job was to tell them God's entire story, would you be able to do it in a single setting in under 5 minutes?
Okay. So could you tell God's story?
Entire story. And I mean entire story of the Bible in 5 minutes or less.
Okay. All right, man.
Do that.
I hope that
it's like my mission. My mission is that everybody at my church can say yes to that and then do it.
Won't you feel really bad if I don't ask any more questions after the next one, because this one went so bad?
Yeah, I've started and stopped a lot of things in my life, unfortunately. So,
hey man, always good seeing you, talking to you. I walk away happier. So good to see you, man. And thanks for your work. Till next time.
Yeah, brother.